So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors. So you've started world building, you're getting your feet wet, and this is the next step here. This is the deep dive into world building. So the number one thing we're going to start with is your world is going to change. It's absolutely going to change. In every writing, in anything that you've ever seen on the screen, there have been multiple drafts, and you have to go in thinking that. We have a world called Dragon Grin, and it is so vastly different now as things, I describe it like a crossword puzzle. When you really anchor something in that you love, it's kind of like now you have some clues, some letters for the next thing, and you kind of start filling it in, but don't sweat it. Don't be like, well, I got to figure out what the monks are like in my world right now forever because we're never going back. And it's like, not really true, especially what we're talking about too is not published worlds. That would probably be a different video. I'm talking about you at home with your group. If you want to write a world, maybe that's a little more stressful, but just don't sweat it. It'd kind of be my first thing to kick off. It's going to change. Be cool with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird sort of hang up that I see in a lot of people who try to world build that just like absolutely does not need to be there. Of like you start to get this like the world's gonna set into concrete sort of thing of like once I say something is like this in the world, then that's just how it is in the world, and I'll just have to deal with it. Like if I come up with a name that I don't like in a year, what am I gonna do? Or if I build a faction like this and then I actually kind of wish it was like that. Like, oh, such a bummer that my world won't be able to be the way that I just like none of those things. Like there's no law that says you can't just change your world. If you come up with something that's like, that fits in the moment, you're running a game, you need an answer, you say something, and then after that session you realize you don't like it, like there's nothing wrong with just saying like, oh, actually I said this, but really I think it'd suit the world better if I changed it to be that instead. Like it's totally okay to view the world as a work in progress. Like every time that you go to build something, nothing's locked down, nothing's set in stone. Like Tim said, until you like publish it and you put it out into the world as a product. And even then, like Tolkien revised Middle Earth, like after writing The Hobbit, when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he went back and rewrote things in The Hobbit to suit what he changed to be the case in Lord of the Rings. Like even the big worlds that we think of when we think of like the best world building things like Middle Earth and things like that, were constantly changed and updated. There's nothing wrong with changing details or renaming things or coming up with new ideas or revising old ideas, and kind of always viewing it as something that you can mold into what you need it to be rather than like viewing it as something that's locked down forever.
Yeah. And just like you said, with the published works between, fictional works like that, where they're just stories, and even for RPG worlds, both to use ours, we published a couple of books that focused on Dragon Grin. And we decided at that time, once it's published, that's canon. And then we eventually revised that because, things need to change. I don't have as much experience with all of these, but I'm sure that every time a new Eberron book comes out, I think one came out recently, something changed. Every time they, revamp Spelljammer, every time, even in RPG worlds, White Wolf keeps coming out with Vampire, the whatever, different subtitle. Something is changing there because they learned something or they like something else more, or it just makes far more sense to make it exactly what you want it rather than feeling trapped in something that you feel like you can't change. And even, publishers will do this after the fact where they'll release other lore or they'll say something that colors what happened in the book differently, but something that was never written down, a particular, something about a particular character that kind of might change the way you feel about their actions. They likely decided that after the fact, otherwise they would have written it in the book. And then even to take that a little further, probably your most favorite narrative elements came from the constant in progress state of like a movie or a book or something, where at some point they're like, at this point we need somebody to, be revealed as the killer. They didn't write it the whole time with the killer in mind. They put it all together and then they decided, and like, now we have to go back and change this part so it makes sense and this part so it makes sense. basically changing things and it being a work in progress is sort of the only way to write. It's the only way to really make good writing. And it's very likely the way that all of your favorite things have been written. So just embrace that, don't feel tied down by it.
Yeah, that's so spot on. And the amount of special features on DVDs that reveal the things that are like, oh yeah, at the last minute. Like there's a huge scene in a recent Marvel movie that was done in the editing phase. It's one of the most iconic scenes in probably any Marvel film, and they were in the editing room. And they're like, oh, so-and-so should say this. So they called the actor back in and had the whole thing reshot to fit that in. And this is the other thing I was going to say. Like, you got to bring it back to the big, fat, flexing G. What's the goal? What is the goal of your world building? And I think so often we have to be honest with ourselves. World building and playing a game in the world can be very different things. As writers, we want to write novels sometimes. And so we want to write and have all these things, but what's the goal? Are you making a world for players to come and enjoy? Or are you writing a story? Because sometimes we'll forget which one we're doing and why. So if you get caught up in, like James, what you're saying, where, no, this is this way and this is this way, this, in my opinion, should be collaborative to some degree. Some of the best ideas that I've had pop up for, like, things in the world are things that players suggested because they were inspired. Hey, I want to play a warlock. What would that look like? Oh, I don't know. Let's talk it through. What about this? Well, I was kind of thinking I wanted to do this patron. Oh, okay, cool. Well, then in Dragon Grin, that would kind of be this. How does that sound? Oh, yeah. And can she be this? Oh, that would be great. Now, again, we're not talking about published worlds. We happen to publish this world, but we're pinning that for this whole conversation and saying that the players will then put this pin down, and then from there, this entire sphere will basically crop up from their inspiration and their imagination. So don't forget, what's the goal? Is it to play and build a story together, or are you writing a fantasy book? Don't mix the two up.
Yeah, and I think that there's a very important line that goes across exactly what you're saying there of, like, who are you making this for and how do you want it to be used? If you're just writing your world because it brings you joy to write it, and who cares what everybody else thinks, then it's like, it doesn't really matter necessarily where you put the time and energy, because you should put it where you want to, because you're doing it because you want to do that. The reason that I bring that up is I think that it's very easy for world builders, especially first time or starting out world builders, to put a lot of energy into things that, like, just don't matter if you're trying to run a setting for players of, like, all right, I've got this super intricate calendar system with all these different months and days and seasons and lunar phases and solar phases and this cosmology that outstretches into all these different fractured layers. And it's just like, hey, if you're writing that because you want to, and that's the goal, was just like, I enjoy writing this, so I'm going to do that. That's totally fine. I'm not here to say that that's wrong. But no one in your game is going to use any of that when you play. And it's just like, if the goal is to build the world that people are playing in, then making sure that you put most of your time and energy into, the place that the party is going to be in, the culture that they're going to be interacting with, the classes and how they appear in the world, and how it feels to be a person kind of in day-to-day life. Like, that stuff is going to get a lot more mileage than something like a crazy complicated calendar or a cosmology that's so grand and so far out that the people on the ground level aren't going to even be able to interact with it. Like, it's only a waste of time if you were designing it for the goal of being used rather than just for your own edification. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But you do kind of have to be conscious of, like, am I writing this for me, or am I writing this to be used in a game? And that'll drastically change where your time is spent and where you should most focus your energy. And you should just be aware of that, of, like, this is a for me section and this is a for the game section. There's, and that's how I'm going to.
Can I ask for a comment real quick before you say? I just want to say, anyone watching the video, what's the most you've ever prepped, like what he just described, that was never used? I want to know that painful thing. We've all done it. What's yours? So please, James,
definitely
continue.
Yeah.
I really like that. Really putting the I can't think of a good word. I really like focusing on prioritizing, I guess is the word. The idea that you have to be aware of what the players are going to use eventually. This is why running a game for your players is perfect, because when the time the game starts, you have to have something for them to do. So you have to start thinking. But, absent of that, just prioritizing and not spending too much of your time on, like you said, something that you may not get a lot of use of, is just a really good way to approach it. Another very important thing is remembering that you can always go back and change things. It can be a lot of fun to really let your players take the wheel. I played in a game called The Winds of Cerceline by Be a Better Game Master, GM'd by Barker, in his world of Ankea. And just like Dragongrin has come a very, very, very long way and would be indistinguishable from what it is now a long time ago, it's kind of becoming the same with Ankea. But Barker did this thing where just about at every turn, he would call on the players to make up world lore, like big things that some people, some world builders would be so protective of, that, oh no, you can't name my king. I want to be the one that names the king, is kind of the feeling that some people could get even without realizing it. But again, remembering that anything can change, Barker let us make all those decisions, and we collaboratively really built this really fun campaign, and all kind of had a hand in it, from the smallest little what this room might look like to who the murderer was in a sort of murder investigation thing. But he can just go back and change it if he wants it, and he has significantly. So he got both the fun of playing with people and building it and getting the best ideas from the people you're playing with, as well as being able to say, well, I like this, that doesn't really fit anymore. So again, just having fun and really diving into it and not worrying about what the world's going to end up like, and then kind of curating all the little pieces you want, is a good way to do it, because you get to pick exactly what you want it to be.
Yeah. And just to interject real quick there, of just like, that can be a great way to ensure the practical needs of the players are met too, because if they need to know who their god is as a cleric, they're going to ask, hey, what are the gods like in this world? And if you can just say like, hey, like, go ahead and, make something, and then we'll put it in the world. If we like it, I'll keep it forever. And if we need to change it, then we'll change it. But that can be a great way, by tossing it to the players and saying like, you want to play a fighter? What are fighters in this world? Are you a soldier? Are you you train off and, and kind of letting them kind of take that and run with it. It's a great way to make sure that those sort of practical elements that you need to have for the game to work get covered, because they're going to cover them, because they need to play their character and have that information.
Yeah. Yes. And so all right, first thing I'm going to do is cop to being overly picky with what people put in the world. This is a while ago. I've come a long way. We're going to put a pin in that real quick and just say, I want to talk about something that's going to seem like, I think, equally existential and whoa, but also like really pragmatic, which is the existential part is this game only exists in the mind of you and the people you play with that session and that campaign. In the world of streaming, it's changed a bit, but this is where it gets pragmatic. How many people are actually following all of your sessions and watching all of your videos and reading all of your posts? The fact is, not a lot comparatively. And then what is the importance? So even if you're the exception to that rule and you're like, no, I have like 200 people, they watch all my games, and it's like fantastic. So now all you've done is expand the model. That world now lives in the minds of that many people. But how many more don't know what it is? And you could create something totally new. So in Barker's Cerceline game, if he ran Cerceline for his home group, I think it's actually really interesting that he could completely change it entirely and make it so that this is this thing and this is this. And that would be their Ankea that lived in their realm. And so, again, just practically speaking, the the amount of people who are going to know about your world and learn about it, don't sweat it, because the people who matter are the ones who it's going to be in front of. Anyway, I'll let one of you guys talk because I've said a lot, but I do want to circle back on me being a little too handsy with my own lore and being like, no.
Yeah, I did just kind of wanted to touch in on something that you said there, and then we can circle back around to that definitely, because I've had my own experiences with that too. So I'm happy to talk about that. But you do, I think, bring up a very important point of like a world for a tabletop RPG is very different than a world for a book, where a setting in a tabletop game is meant to create an experience out of those elements. Like the elements themselves are not the story; they're just tools that you use to make the story. So that there's nothing that says that it has to be the same across all experiences. Like Tim said, if I run Dragon Grin for one group, it might be super, super, even more dark and even more grim than it's written, where another group that's maybe a little bit more humorous, a little bit more lighthearted, less like super hardcore and dramatic, maybe it's a little goofier than, it might otherwise be written. And like neither of those versions are the wrong Dragon Grin. Like those aren't like there's not an incorrect interpretation and a correct interpretation. Those are both kind of valid points that can spring forth from the sort of melting pot of ideas that the setting ends up being. So there's nothing that says, it can't be different for different people and different across different experiences, and kind of allowing it to sort of take its own individual shape with the people that you're using it with in that moment can kind of be a great way to identify what works across the broad area of the setting and kind of what's very group specific. Another example of that is, I ran a test of the setting that I'm working on, Glyph, and I was not remotely expecting it to have like a superhero sort of theme. And the game that we ran felt very like comic booky, very superhero sort of thing. And that's not really what I imagined the setting to feel like. But the people who were in that game are very much into that sort of feel. So of course it kind of sprung out naturally from that, because that's kind of who they are as people. Where if I ran it for somebody else who was like super into like the grim sort of fantasy angle of it, then that would have kind of come to life a lot more. So it's totally okay to kind of let the group dictate different parts of the setting that are going to come to life versus kind of stay dormant, depending on specific, experiences with them. And that's all kind of valid across the board.
So I think that something that I think is worth mentioning is I think of it a lot like, say it this way, and we're getting a little off into the weeds in terms of world building specifically, because we have a very unique sort of situation. We have the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group, so a lot of us talk and we experience each other's worlds and that kind of thing. But if someone takes and runs your world differently, it is one of the most, I think it's a compliment, because it's almost like someone doing a cover of one of your songs is kind of how I think of it. Like, it's like, oh no, cool, that's a really cool cover. Yeah, it's an acoustic cover, or like you say, the goofy Dragon Grin. But what a cool thing that something that we created is inspiring someone to take hours of their time and devote, and make stories with other people with. That said, one of the things that I wanted to do, and I have no plans particularly, so I'm just springing this on the two of you, but I would like to get into something very practical if we can, like whatever that is, like some boots on the ground. Okay, a lot of good theory here, and I think that it was worth talking about, but taking it away from talking heads, like what do we do? Someone's like, okay, cool guys, I get it. I'm bought in. I'm going to do what you say. Now, what do I do? Like, how can we help people? How can we help us from 3 years ago, not get gray in the...
So I don't think we can help that. So
okay.
We can end the video there if that's the big old flex and G you're on.
I'm thinning a little bit up here if you could help me out.
I found the solution to that, actually. I don't know if you noticed. No, but for me, what I like to do is I like to look at things, usually video games, but this works with movies and television shows and stuff too. I like to look at them and take a specific scene or something, not even necessarily like a a scene between characters, more like a literal environment or something, like a really cool like cliff face that a boat comes up to. And there's like it leads upward into maybe this large city, clockwork city. I'm just saying words now, but everybody's now imagining their own version of this.
Yeah, you got me.
But say I'm playing, yeah, right.
I'm in.
But that's from roughly from Dishonored 2 I've been playing. But the idea is if I take that scene and kind of think, oh man, what if when the players got here, X, Y, and Z happened? And then I go, okay, well, so that's it. That's my first scene. I'm going to go put up an interest post of, all right, X, Y, and Z happens on this, at this place. And then from there, probably using, whatever I'd like, or my world, or in this case, Dishonored, because I'm like, oh, kind of feeling that. I would just take some of the elements they have, kind of a very grim feeling, really authoritarian kind of government. You just those things and kind of throw them in a pot and mix them up. And then after posting the interest post, when people kind of want to play, I'll begin prepping and again, just using all of those elements now completely separate from the game, start building what that will be. That can eventually become a world. But by running a game, based on a lot of the things we've talked about, if a player asks that perfect example, I'm a paladin, who do I worship? Okay, well, I have to come up with this. If you don't want to come up with that, it's perfectly fine to go, we're using the Forgotten Realms Pantheon. We're just going to mash that right in here. But most paladins are not, very good. They're maybe more in the middle. Now I've just turned it on its head where I'm like, okay, well, you're picking a different god if you want to be a paladin. And by doing just those few things that have taken overall really very little effort from me, I'm beginning the work of creating my world in the players' heads. We all get together, and then that's really when we start creating it. So I guess not super practical advice just for world building alone.
Very practical advice.
For running a game, it's a really good way to get started, because having a few other people that are to some degree inspired about the same thing right now, it's kind of like making your own little think tank and seeing, well, where does this lead?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it can be understated the value that like running games in a world that's kind of in the early stages can have for how much it will affect how that world is built. Like for me, it's like hands down the best way to world build is to just like come up with like just the very barest bones concepts, the highest level pillars and feeling that you can, and then just start playing in the world, and you'll very quickly kind of discover where things are kind of wanting to fall. And you can kind of, it helps direct your attention towards the things that are going to be most important to what you're doing. In the sense that like, if you have to prep a game, and that like, okay, well, they're in this town and they need to go to this place. So I'll need to figure out what that place is. Okay, so what's the culture kind of going to be like? Is that kind of across this whole area of the world, or is that specific to this town? And it kind of gets you just asking questions about what you're making. And it helps to kind of, I think, avoid some of that time sink problem that we were talking about before, where it's just like world building can sometimes be like building a bridge that you need to cross like as you build it. It doesn't help to build the end of the bridge if you can't get to that point from where you are now.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of use kind of games as a way to direct attention, then you can sort of build what you need and then kind of have a foundation for the world to sit on. And then as you continue to expand out the scope of the game, it can then kind of build the world out automatically for you. It's like one of my favorite ways to build a world is honestly just to like build literally the only thing I'm going to build in the entire world right now is just specifically the place that the players are starting in and the first action that they're going to take in the world. And that's like session 1 of the game. And that's like the starting point of the world. And then as you build out the game, you build out the world kind of as they explore it. You can basically just build out as you play the game. So instead of having to have this monumental, huge world where you have to feel like everything is made up beforehand, and if a player asks, what's across the ocean or how many different gods there are, that you have to have an answer right then and there, or else you've like failed them. No, like that's not the case. Like it's totally okay to have a lot of blank space in your world, knowing that as you continue to build it and as you continue to play in it, that you're going to fill in those spaces eventually, like when you come to need it. And like it's totally okay to world build practically, of just say, I'm going to build this because I need it to play next session. And that's why I'm building it. And that's all I'm going to worry about. And even if there's a bunch of blank space and a bunch of things I don't know, it's okay. We'll fill out those details when we need them, and then eventually we'll have a world.
Yeah, and there's plenty of media that does exactly what you just said, Jeff. But you have no idea what's across the ocean because that's not the story. There are plenty of films or worlds that you're like, I don't know, they don't talk about that because it's not important to the story. And so that's not what matters. That's not the point of the narrative. So it's like theater. You can have a chair and that's a set. That is the set for the whole play because that's all you need is the chair. And it doesn't make the story any less, enrapturing because it's about the characters, And so, two things. The first thing I was going to say is we talk about, in 1 second, I'm going to give you, especially if you're not publishing a world and you're just running a game, I'm going to give you the laziest, best hack in the whole world. But first, the thing I was going to mention is you're going to hear a lot. If you Google it or if you talk to people, they have the method that Jeff just described, which is world building from in and building out. And then there are other people who start really big and then zoom in. I found a good balance of both of those things, and it's doing what you said. The world building from a small point and building outward is in a session. The world building big and in toward is the stuff I do between sessions. And so if you kind of think of it that way, it's a both and scenario. It's not a one or the other. It's do both. Start with what you need for the session, like you said, and then that slowly starts doing this. But then you can be thinking, oh, what is this city? Oh, there's going to be this person. And that's stuff you can just do on your lunch break and whatever. So here's the hack. The hack is you just absolutely can go online and type in any video game world, and there's a wiki for it. So like Dragon Age wiki, Witcher wiki, anything like this. And just you can use exactly what their stuff is and change the name, and your players won't care. They'll just be like, oh, cool. It will automatically start to diverge as they make their own choices. But what it does is it gives you this huge boilerplate thing. You'll also start imagining yourself, this is different. And no, I don't want this. And oh, the mask means this. And this clockwork. And no, I don't want this. I saw this in, this Netflix show and I want to put this in there. And these, that'll all start happening. The other thing is, so that's the lazy hack where you're just like, cool, yeah, we're playing in Dragon Age, but there's two paths. You can tell the players that, but it comes with a lot of expected baggage sometimes. Or you could just not. And the players just think you're like this world building god. And you're like, they're like, hey, what next session? And you just type in Dragon Age wiki, crime, whatever. And it's just like, oh, cool. Yeah. So there's this faction, Elder Scrolls. One final piece, though. If you trust your players, you can also say, hey, I'm modeling it after The Witcher. Because that can also get you a ton of shared ground where they're like, oh, cool, okay, I'm there. Then all you have to do is say, well, what's a little different, though, is that instead of X, Y. And they go, oh, cool, I'm down with that. So that's it. That's like a big hack of just grab something if you want, and whoosh, there you go. You built a world, and then just change what you want, and you're done.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially with taking from more than one place. That's what most worlds are anyways. Like, there's a lot of information taken from a lot of sources that kind of end up in this melting pot that when blended together, it ends up being sort of your own unique experience and your unique world, I have no problem saying this. Like, there's so many things in the worlds that I make that I've taken from the Dark Souls games, there's a concept in those where it's like, the the cleric miracles basically are like stories told about the past, about the things that are happening, and that like casts the spell. Like I've just taken that idea and put it in my world, but I've also taken this from Star Wars and that from Middle Earth and then this other thing from Dragon Grin, and then and then you have all these kind of small micro elements that you borrow, and then when they start to meet each other, things have to change for it to kind of all make sense, and then you end up with something that feels radically unique, even if it's made up of parts that come from history and mythology and other media and movies and video games. Like there's a kind of collision point that happens where suddenly they all adapt to each other, where it's like, okay, well, if that's the case with this, but then I also have this element, then in order for those two things to coexist, I'm going to have to change this a little bit, I'm going to have to change that a little bit, and now they can work together. And then suddenly you do that with all these different parts and ideas that you've taken, or been inspired by. And then suddenly you have an entire world that's yours. And I think that it's something that I'm sure we've talked about before, but just in case I'll say it. Nobody will know. Like if you take from enough places and like mask it enough ways, like people won't realize. It's just like, oh, well, you've just taken this scene from that game, but then put it in this scene from that world. And it's just like people don't connect those dots, so it's totally okay to like let those inspirations flow freely, because the end point, once they're filtered through your own creativity, are going to be very different from anything that kind of entered the input stage.
Yeah, and if they do know, they won't care.
Exactly, or if they recognize something, it won't matter because it is now surrounded by all of these other things that are a little different. So I feel of the three of us, the least qualified to make this sort of analogy, but it's a lot like writing music in the sense that in general, all of the notes are known and have been played. So if you say, oh man, I really like the tuning of that guitar and that, so I'm going to tune my guitar to that. I'm like, okay, well, as long as you don't play the exact same notes in the exact same order at the same tempo, well, it's different. But I'm like, yeah, okay, well, you used the 1-3-5 chord progression. Well, I'm like, well, so has basically most people that write music kind of thing.
Sure.
Where if you break it down where the parts are easier to see separately, and then you realize, well, that how many songs have used the same chords, the same key, the same tempo, the same, all of these different things. And like you said, one, they won't notice until somebody juxtaposes them as people have for great comedic effect, or they won't care because they're enjoying this song. They don't care that it's reminiscent of this or that. It's very much the same thing I'm learning with jokes. In general, if you watch a comedy TV show, a good portion of the jokes are funny because they call out to something else, something that may not even happen in the show. But we don't care. You're like, nobody says, well, that's not funny. They're just making a joke about current events. I'm like, no, it's funny because we both know the same thing. There's a shared context here. So just a lot of ways to kind of really drive it home that you couldn't make the same world if you tried without copying. If you were like, all right, without reading any lore, I'm going to recreate Dark Souls from scratch. You wouldn't be able to do it. You would end up with a really cool world at the end. But then if you were like, all right, let's compare the two, you'd be way off. So yeah, it's so important to pull from things that you know, because otherwise you will never write anything. If your goal is to write something nobody's ever seen, maybe you'll get there, but why don't you just play RPGs in the meantime and have fun?
Yeah. And listen, you want to talk about James, that was masterful. Like that's exactly like chords, like you said, there's only a certain number, of notes, and yet the compositions are almost literally endless. I think that you're just trying to add an extra 15 minutes to this deep dive. No. It's like you get Jeff and I talking about music, but what I was going to say, unless there's anything in particular you guys really want to hit on, I thought it would be fun to end with what are some of the biggest pitfalls? What's the wall someone's going to hit and then decide not to climb over? And kind of do. So was there anything else you guys wanted to hit on based on another topic, or you want to dive in and do some like, hey, here's some boot camp pitfalls, like help boost you over the wall stuff?
I just wanted to really quickly just plant a flag in what James said, because it was so great, just to kind of cap that off real quick, and then I'm down to go into like a practical thing of just like, when it comes to borrowing stuff like that, literally everybody does that throughout all of history. So like, it's not something weird that you're doing that nobody else is doing. Like, people who built, D&D is based off of Middle Earth, which is based off of Norse mythology, which is based off of Germanic mythology, which is based off of the people who were before. It's just like, all these things are kind of built off of each other. So like, there's no shame in borrowing elements from things like that. If there was shame, nobody could make anything, because everything that we make is in some way kind of based off of the things that have come before us and inspired the people who we were inspired by, and so on. So it's okay to go in knowing that there's nothing wrong with doing that. And in fact, that's kind of the essential part of the creative process, is to do that, to take the notes that everybody plays and make your own song with it. That there's a commonality between everybody with that. But I just wanted to be extra specifically clear about that before we move on.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go ahead. So something that I think is really important to say is that it's that commonality that is like, shared references usually bring people closer together. So when you say like, oh yeah, I'm borrowing from this and I'm borrowing from this, especially if you're not publishing, that's actually, I think, something that people like, when something they love is represented in a way. And I think most people can get down with it without bringing in all the baggage. Like, wait, but that's not how it works in Star Wars. That's an outlier case, and it's going to happen, and you just kind of adjust for it. But overall, I think people get excited because they know. They're like, oh, yeah. Oh, hey. And then they'll tap into their shared experiences with that and be like, oh, my gosh, I read this one novel in the expanded universe where these people were invisible to the Force. Can we do a character where I'm like invisible to the Force? And you go, sure, we can make it like a monk. And now all of a sudden, that's the kind of stuff that you're going to remember for 20, 30, 40 years. And, versus like, nah, I mean, that's been done before, so let's not do that, which is kind of the alternative. My first pitfall, kind of getting into the practical side of things, my first pitfall is going to be something that I mentioned previous, and it actually, I think, hits right on what we were just talking about, which is you can't be overprotective with your world, and I was. I very publicly started creating a world called Dragon Grin with James in our Facebook group, and it was something where it was like, it was sort of this collaborative community project, and even that went pretty well. When we started wanting to run games, because I didn't have anything defined, I felt like we were in a writer's room and this stuff was going to film in a week. Like, it was going to be committed to film forever. Like, someone's like, oh, hey, that's a neat map. Can I make it so that, like, minotaurs live over here? And I'm like, I just, I'm not really feeling that. I don't, how would they? And I'm like, I mean, I'm a tone lich. I'm very, very much like, it's like, no, this and this and this, that doesn't fit the tone. And the horns of those creatures wouldn't fit and I really was bad. I think so much so that people, maybe they'll say it now. I don't know if they would even say it then, but I think that it was taxing and deflating. I knew that I would deflate people, and that's not my personality. If you know me, there was one person in particular who had this whole backstory and all this stuff, and I felt like their tech level didn't match the world, and I was inexperienced as a game master and a world builder. So rather than just say, yeah, cool, like for this game, yeah, as I pointed out, like, what's really going to happen? No one knows that, just us. In fact, instead of saying that, I was like, no. Okay, I guess I'll do something else. And this is kind of a bummer, but that's what they're going to remember.
Yeah.
Not, hey, do you remember that time in Dragon Grin when I did X and Y and there was the crazy thing? That's something that I would rather they remember than, oh yeah, I played with Tim once. It was a while back, but like I kept coming up with these character concepts and he wasn't having any of it. So so going back to the point I made, it's more about the shared experience between two people. It's almost like improvisational music or like coming up with something in that moment, having a conversation. It's more about how you feel about it than the actual thing that you're doing. It's the memories you take away from it. So that's the first pitfall. Don't be too protective with your world because it's supposed to be collaborative.
Yeah, and I think some of that comes back to being really careful about defining, who am I doing this for? Am I writing this for me? If so, do I even need to share it? You know, why bother having it be out in the open if I'm not going to allow anybody to touch or look at it without, you know, specifically confirming that it's okay? It's just like, you have to kind of be able to look and say like, no, I want this to be something that people will be able to interact with. And if people are going to interact with it, that means they need to have input that they can put into it to experience it, you know? But yeah, you kind of, you have to be very careful, because I've had that sort of problem too, where it's just like, this is exactly how I want the world to feel, you know, and it's very important that it feels exactly just this way. And then kind of having those moments of like people coming in and being like, oh, it'd be really cool if this sort of thing could happen. And then like, oh, my character is going to do this and he's going to say that. And like, it's very tough to fight that impulse sometimes to be like, why is your character saying that when it's this, you know? And it's just like,
cut, take it from the top.
Yeah, like, yeah, exactly. And it's there's exactly what Tim said of just like, forever, that guy is going to remember that as being what it feels like to be at the table. Even if the whole game was great outside of that moment, it feels so bad to have that sort of hardcore shutdown moment of like, you're doing it wrong, of just like that's really kind of it's what you'll become known for when you do it. You know, even if you don't do it that often, it becomes part of how you're defined, you know, in a lot of ways, as a world builder, as a GM, as a player. And it's just like, yeah, you have to be very, very careful with how much you're going to hold a tight grip. And if you know you can't let go, then don't give it to people.
Yeah, Tim was late to 2 sessions of a relatively popular RPG game, and people still don't let him live it down. So
by minutes,
that's what you'll be known for.
Yeah, like, you know, yeah, exactly. Or I had bad internet for like 2 sessions, and now I have like blazing fast fiber, and people are still like, hey, Tim.
Yeah, 5-6 years later.
I know, they're like, yo.
You've moved a few times.
Yeah, and they're like, hey, still late? Your internet's still slow? I'm like, yeah,
but
thanks.
The one of the biggest pitfalls that I see, and I am doing my best to struggle with a little bit less, to kind of bring it wider and then zoom back into RPGs, I realized something, which was that I will sometimes be a little anxious about certain things because I don't know what's going to happen. And then it occurred to me, well, what happens when that happens, when something unexpected happens and you didn't have time to prepare for it? Well, you improvise. So don't work on preparing. Don't get better at preparing and trying to prepare for every possibility. Get better at improvising. And in that sense, with world building, one of the biggest pitfalls I see is, and we touched on this a little bit, people trying to define everything. But like, when I say everything, I mean everything. So let's say you're running a game and there's a shop and they're like, okay, they're going to go in this shop and there's going to be an altercation. Oh, what does this guy sell? Oh, okay, wait. Well, what's the supply chain like? How does he get his stuff? Well, what's the economy like? And I'm like, whoa. What's the altercation? Let's talk about the important thing. So if one of the players asks, what does he sell here? That's something you should probably have. But if you practice improvising over preparing, and not even over, but in this case, you say, oh, well, it's kind of a general store. They sell a lot of things, especially if that doesn't matter to right now. Or you just decide on the fly, well, he's an armorer. Okay, no further questions. Boom, done. Here's the altercation, you know? So if you do your best to try to remember that you don't have to be an encyclopedia of knowledge and you can lean on the players, and that depending on what's important, it may not come up, just remember, have confidence in yourself that you can come up with an answer fairly quickly if something unexpected comes up. So instead, spend your time focusing on the things that will definitely come up and figure out the rest later.
Yeah. And I'm going to give some very, very specific advice that is absolutely tuned toward our situation. So I think the rest of this video has been really helpful for anyone. Now, what I was going to say is the number one thing that I want to warn people against, if you take all of this advice, so if you do all the things we're saying, do not create a world in a vacuum and expect people to be excited about it when you unveil all 1,000 words of it. It will be a pin dropping in an ocean. It'll be a pin dropping in Times Square. So the specific advice that I would say is, we are a part of a Facebook group called the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group. I have seen a lot of creators have great success by just throwing stuff out there. Hey, I'm thinking of making a new world. You know, it's kind of, this is the vibe, this is the tone. Here's what I think elves might be like. Notice how I'm not being really anchored in with my language. Hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking elves might be like. The community's usually very responsive and very positive, but what that does is it starts conversation with others about the world, and oh, that's cool and that's neat, and it sort of gives you that dopamine hit of someone being interested, which then feeds you to do a little more and feeds you to do a little more. But I've seen this done successfully with several community members, to where what started out as online posts ended up as Kickstarters. I'm not saying you take it to that extreme, but I don't think their Kickstarters would have been as successful had they not very organically and normally just introduced people to the world a little piece at a time. Now, am I saying join the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group and expect everyone to help you build your world? No. Just like any other exchange, there's a currency of give and take. If you join the community, make some thoughtful comments, give some things before you ask for something in return. Just very standard common courtesy. But if you do that, and if you prove that you're not a shill and that you're just there to have someone basically build your world for you, I think you'll find that it's a very positive loop of feedback and inspiration and seeing how other people do it. So my pitfall tied to that, that's the advice, the very specific, like, hey, go and start little pieces. Just go in there and say tieflings or whatever. You will hear me say this a lot because it happened to me. It happens to many. Someone is going to point out how your world is the same as another world. It's fine. In fact, it's a good thing. If you want, you can go and research that thing that they're talking about to see how it was done, so that you can educate yourself on how someone else did it. More than likely, you're going to want to change it anyway and be like, well, that's not what I was thinking at all. I think that this is actually something that is, it's interest disguised as sort of a left-handed compliment, meaning this person is intrigued about your world, or they wouldn't have taken the time to stop and comment. And the fact that it has a seed of something that they remembered means that it's relatable and that there's something recognizable in it. So don't be discouraged. So often I've seen people, they'll say, oh, well, I just saw a Kickstarter for a post-Incan Aztec cyberpunk, so I guess I can't do mine. And it's like, listen, do what you were going to do and don't worry about it. But that's my two pieces that I'm going to wrap up with.
I guess one final pitfall for me, because I haven't shared any of mine yet. Something that I've definitely had struggle with, that I've definitely come to terms with now a lot more, is that, like, you can make pieces of your world that you're very excited about, but the things that you love about your world are not always going to be the same things that other people like about your world too. So I'll give a specific example, a setting that I made a while back. I don't really use it much anymore. I may do something with it someday, but at least for now, it was like very, very kind of based off of like medieval alchemy, where there's all these like different symbols and this very like esoteric mystical language, and like all this like very different like meanings that have like complex like spiritual, relationships to those like more mundane chemical, symbols and things like that. That was also set in like this kind of like post-apocalyptic Gothic era thing. And like I ran a game in it, and like so many people like really, really latched hard onto the like the post-apocalyptic part. And it could, for a little bit, it was kind of like a bummer of like, man, I had like I've put so much of my energy into this part of the world, and everyone is over here with this part of the world, like, oh man, like, what am I doing wrong? And the answer is like nothing. Like, it's totally okay for different people to have different parts of a world that they like and that they gravitate towards too. And the fact that they have anything at all that they're like really latching onto strongly in your setting is an indication that you're doing something well. So to kind of take it off of my specific personal example and kind of into a broad thing, I see this a lot with Star Wars, where it's just like somebody will run, some people will look at Star Wars and be like, oh man, bounty hunters and the grimy outer ring and crime. And it's just like, hey, that's great. When I think of Star Wars, I think Jedi, lightsabers, the Force. When somebody else thinks Star Wars, they might think bounty hunters, Mandalorians and crime and, smugglers. It's okay for everyone to kind of have their own range in a setting that they really latch towards. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the things that you really like are bad. It's just kind of everyone has a different range of interests. And by finding people with more different scopes of interest, you can learn more about your setting in different contexts and use it kind of as a tool to dive deeper into different things and kind of flesh out, well, he really liked this part of the setting, so I'm going to make a little bit more there, but he really liked that, so I'm going to make a little bit there. And then it makes everything about your setting more well-rounded when you can see what other people think of your setting and kind of hone those edges, in addition to just doing what you're passionate about personally.
Yeah, there's literally no substitute to an entire life of experiences that culminate in someone's perspective at that moment on your world. So get from that what you can and don't worry about it so much.
Sure. And sometimes popular demand is a good indicator. Maybe you're focusing on the wrong thing. Maybe you got to kill your darling. Maybe your world isn't about spiritual alchemy. Maybe you have such a fresh take on the post-apocalyptic. People are like, yeah, which is actually a huge compliment because there's a lot of media. There's a lot of stuff going on there. So it's like, wow, yeah, really, this is really cool. I like this. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. In terms of comments, we asked earlier, put the biggest thing you've prepped and never used, but also what's your biggest world building problem right now? I'm not saying guaranteed, but maybe we'll do a follow-up video where we answer specific questions, or things of that nature. So what's like your biggest pitfall, or if maybe you've got a good handle on things, what's your advice? Like, hey, this is the thing that I learned and this is why I do it. We'd love to hear that. So we're Tabletop Terrors. We're absolutely all about fun, creativity, and RPGs. If you dig that kind of stuff, subscribe and then hit the notification bell so you'll see when our videos come out. But I guess unless anybody else has anything else to say, speak now or forever hold your peace. It's time for the toast. Let's do a Tabtarian toast. Sorry, I had to say it. Me. No, you.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
And may you conquer everything you undertake.
I wanted to keep making jokes.
Yeah.
I know, but I was like, we'll never get through the toast because this will just go on forever.
I wanted to do it one more time. And then I also didn't want... I know this probably wouldn't happen, but I didn't want you to explode into a rage. I don't know why I imagined that happening. I don't think it would. But
No.
So wonderful.
Yeah.
Tabletop Terrors is over. No, my thing was I was going to do a fake first part of the toast, and then, like I said, that would have just launched us into the sun. So make sure you click another one of these videos. If you really hate Tim's sweater or you're a really big Chris Ware fan of this shirt from about 10 years ago.
Subscribe to